In 1942, Miss Marple solved The Case of the Caretaker, one of her short stories. 25 years later, Agatha Christie reused the plot for her superb standalone novel, Endless Night. The novel was adapted into a feature film in 1972, starring Haley Mills, and believe it or not, despite the seemingly out-of-place gratuitous sex and violence, the film is quite accurate to the book. I think it's pretty good, though I know I'm in the minority. However, the adaptation we're going to talk about today is the 2013 TV film adaptation, which reinserts Miss Marple. As I've mentioned before, there are other Agatha Christie films with Miss Marple added in, and a goodly number of them are disasters. Let's see how it works with a story that, in a sense, featured Miss Marple to begin with. As always, spoiler warning for both book and film. Our protagonist and first-person narrator is Mike Rogers, a penniless young man who can't help dreaming of owning beautiful, expensive things. His ideal spot to build a house is a breathtaking piece of land, whose name I'm not going to repeat because it's a slur on the Romani people. He makes friends with an architect named Santonix, who says he'll build the perfect house for him if Mike ever finds the money to afford it, though he warns Mike there might not be enough time, as Santonix is terminally ill. One day, Mike meets a beautiful girl named Ellie. They hit it off immediately, and Mike tells her all his impossible dreams. While he's showing her where he wants his house to be built, a frightening old woman, Esther Lee, appears and warns them, well, mainly she warns Ellie, of danger and death if they stay here. This land is cursed, she says. Ellie is frightened by Mrs. Lee's warning, but nevertheless she and Mike eventually decide to get married and build a house on that spot, whereupon Ellie reveals she's one of the richest young women in the world. Mike, in his narration, reflects on how happy he was that day, foreshadowing eventual tragedy and doom. The film, which was adapted by Kevin Elliott, begins with a flashback to an event we haven't yet been told about in the book, in which Mike fails to save a childhood friend from falling through the ice and drowning. The character Santonix is replaced by the dead boy's brother, Robbie, who wants to build Mike a house out of gratitude for risking his life. Miss Marple enters the story by taking the place of a random stranger who Mike talks to about the land that's for sale and the local superstitions surrounding it. She also witnesses Mike's first meeting with Mrs. Lee, who quotes the poem by William Blake that gives us the title and foreshadows Mike's fate.
Some are born to sweet delight.
Some are born to endless night.
The film has a limited runtime, so the pace feels a teeny bit rushed, but Elliott is efficient enough with the dialogue to get across Mike's character. This isn't one of those adaptations where Miss Marple steals the protagonist's thunder. And the atmosphere is just creepy and foreboding enough to build suspense without teetering into melodramatic. The only thing I have to complain about so far, and I know this is because I was spoiled by Haley Mills, is this version of Ellie. This character is perky, spunky, a little bit impish, all likable traits, but that's not what Ellie is supposed to feel like. Ellie is described in the book as unsubstantial, delicate, materializing from nowhere, all indicators that, and this is a bit of an early giveaway, that she's on a different plane of existence. I'm sorry, but you just can't do Endless Night and not give Ellie this otherworldly quality. Returning to the book, Mike and Ellie get married in secret with help from Ellie's best friend, Greta. Greta is an important character, but it's a while before we meet her in the flesh. She was hired initially as Ellie's chaperone, but she's become more of a secret conspirator, going out of her way to help Ellie escape the restrictions placed on her by her relations. While Santonix is building their house, Mike and Ellie meet Ellie's relations, as well as her lawyers. One lawyer, Andrew Lippincott, played in the older film by George Sanders, is a kind of godfather to Ellie. Mike finds him shrewd and discomfiting. Finally, they move into their new house and are able to be alone together. Except they're not. The relatives decide to relocate and are suddenly too close for comfort. Mrs. Lee's harassment and threats get even worse, which surprises one of the locals, Major Philpott, who says Mrs. Lee is usually honey-tongued around rich people. Could it be that someone's bribing her to torment the newlyweds? Ellie becomes good friends with another local named Claudia Hardcastle, who happens to be Santonix's sister. She and Ellie both like horse riding, and both suffer from allergies. A further strain is put on the household when Ellie sprains her ankle and Greta comes to take care of her. Greta ends up staying indefinitely and begins to overstep herself, resulting in a violent quarrel between her and Mike. When Santonix visits and finds Greta living here, he's not happy. He tries to give Mike a warning.
Have you any idea where you're going, Mike?
What? Look, I'm going the way I want.
I can't reach you.
We're more than 2/3 into the novel and still no body is dropped, but the suspense is higher than ever, which is why the story is more thriller than mystery. Between the narrator's foreshadowing and the hints that Mike and Ellie are being watched, plotted against, we can tell that this is all building up to something, and that something seems to be Ellie's death. She goes out for a ride one morning, alone, and doesn't come back. Mike and Major Philpott discover her body. It seems she fell from the horse. The cause of death is unclear, but it's hinted that Mrs. Lee, or someone disguised as Mrs. Lee, frightened her, and she died of shock. The curse that Mike and Ellie were warned about seems to have come true. The middle chunk of the film, while accurate to the book's plot, tries to steer the story slightly back into the realm of whodunit, which makes sense since that's what fans of the Marple film series who hadn't read the book probably expected. Robbie is set up to be a suspect by implying he has feelings for Mike and is therefore jealous of Ellie. It's an interesting new spin on the character, but it comes at a great cost, as I'll show you later. Greta, when she finally appears, is portrayed pretty accurately, but in her scenes with Mike and Ellie, the tension they're obviously going for comes out more as awkwardness. It's a bit of a letdown after the scene with the relatives where the tension is palpable. The missing subtle enmity between Greta and Santonix is also an unfortunate loss. A toast to Ellie! Your health, long life to you, and good luck to Mike here, and... yes? And to me? And to you... what's coming to you? Miss Marple continues to stand in for throwaway characters from the book until she settles in as Major Philpott's replacement. Of course, it wouldn't be a Miss Marple film without some snooping, in this case into Mrs. Lee's home. Miss Marple finds evidence not only that someone bribed Mrs. Lee, but also that something sinister has happened to her. Even though this part was added, it's a strong inclusion because a great deal of information has been presented to us by telling rather than showing. For instance, it's easy to forget who Claudia is because everything we've learned about her has been through second-hand dialogue. I'm glad they incorporated a lot of Mike's narration, and I understand that with only 90 minutes runtime they have to rely on it quite a bit, but I think it goes just a little too far, and the film suffers as a result. One scene from the book that they skipped entirely was one where Ellie says,
"Why were you looking at me like that, darling?
Like what?
As if you loved me so much it made you sad."
This scene contains what turns out to be a pivotal moment, so when I saw this film for the first time, and this scene never happened, it blew me away. In the last part of the book, Mike's grief makes events seem hazy. He does a little bit of investigation, in which a lot of evidence seems to implicate Claudia. Multiple coincidences and an anonymous message build up more and more suspicion against her, but then she dies. In fact, she dies while out riding, just like Ellie. After that, the characters start dropping like flies. First, Mrs. Lee's body is found in a quarry, and then Santonix finally succumbs to his illness. Just before he dies, he has one last thing to say to Mike, in an amazing scene.
"You damned fool. Why didn't you go the other way?"
Which leads us to the last awesome twist Agatha Christie ever gave us. Mike Rogers, the narrator, and Greta, his rival, have been in cahoots from the beginning. When they first met, Greta planned it so that Mike would seduce Ellie, marry her, then inherit her money when she died. Somehow Greta was able to sense that Mike had killed before, like when he drowned the boy under the ice, for his wristwatch. Mike murdered Ellie by cyanide poisoning. That's why Claudia died too, because the poison was in the allergy pills, which Ellie shared with Claudia. Mike was the one who bribed Mrs. Lee so that Ellie's death could be blamed on Mrs. Lee, or someone impersonating her. When Mike returns home, Victorious, he receives a series of shocks. First, as he makes his way to the house, he passes the spot where he first encountered Ellie, and he sees her standing there. He sees her, but she doesn't see him. Then he finds out Greta doesn't want to live in the house, which Mike prizes more than anything else. Lippincott sends him a photograph of Mike and Greta together from when they truly first met. He knows. But worst of all is Mike's realization that he did, in fact, love Ellie.
As if you loved me so much it made you sad.
He could have been happy with her, and he killed her. He'd had one chance at true happiness, and he's destroyed it. Mike strangles Greta, and then lets himself be taken away. Here is where the film diverges most from the book. It's Miss Marple who finds the bodies of Claudia and Mrs. Lee, as well as other clues, and we're led to believe she and Mike are working together to find Ellie's killer. After it's revealed that Mike and Greta are the murderers, we jump to a confrontation between Mike and Miss Marple, saving the revelation that Mike has murdered Greta until a few minutes later. I was unsure how I felt about upping this story's ratio of mystery to thriller, but this scene was quite satisfying, proving that it worked, and Julia Mackenzie is a delight as always.
You know every trick in the book, don't you? But the path you take, Michael, is down to you.
This is the only film parallel to Santonix's final line. Speaking of Santonix, his counterpart also shows up for the climax. In the book, it was Mike's mother who found the wristwatch and realized Mike was a killer, but in the film, Robbie finds it and realizes the truth. He burns down Mike's house with himself in it, and the last we see of Mike is in a jail cell, writing this manuscript. Unsurprisingly, with Kevin Elliott writing the script, overall this was both a strong film and an ultimately faithful adaptation. The main plot points all receive representation, the characters are, mostly, portrayed accurately and engagingly, and the narrator as murderer twist paid off for once. As for Miss Marple, she fit into the story quite nicely simply by filling in for other characters. The only thing that really needed to change for her presence to make sense was that Mike didn't give up after killing Greta, so Miss Marple was needed to piece things together and help bring him down in the end. She also adds a piece of insight.
I expect you told Greta you loved her, too. The tragedy is, Michael, you don't know how.
So, all in all, this film did a great job. I have no trouble recommending it. I just don't like it. The film contains everything it needs to make it work, but it lacks one element from the book that, for me at least, is the centerpiece.
Living happy, you know. Married to her.
He says this so casually, at a point just after the first big revelation where the energy is so low, but this is supposed to be a dark and dreadful realization.
You planned it. You lost me this house. And worst of all, you lost me, Ellie.
No, Mike.
One moment of clarity, followed by descent into madness.
How could you say you could ever have loved that poor girl when all the time you were planning to kill her?
This line changes the story intrinsically. It implies that Mike was deluding himself, which I admit is a possible interpretation, but frankly it's not mine, and that's where I disconnect from the telling of the story. The conclusion might be the same, but we lose the true tragedy of it. I wish I'd known then that we were happy. I had my chance. Perhaps everyone has a chance. I turned my back on it. I'm aware that I prefer stories to be more dramatic, within reason, and this film was written so it had no need for Mike to be remorseful, but I feel like it's a loss. I was looking forward to that moment, and in the end, my reaction was a bit the same as Miss Marple's. Well, thank you all for watching. I might be taking a short break from these videos. I auditioned for a local theater production of Clue, and I was cast as Wadsworth, so I'll be a little busy for the next couple months. But I'll be back, I promise.